Head of Shasta College, how you doing? Humanities 4, Film Studies. It is here the first week of November after Halloween. On our way to Thanksgiving break, which I don't even know when that is, next week, I think. But today we're talking about the 1980s, a decade that was challenging to artistic filmmakers, to auteur filmmakers. It's the decade where the big sequels took over. And if you saw the documentary, it shows the end of the 70s, ends with the movie Raging Bull, which came out in about 80 or 79, thereabouts. And it was considered the last of the auteur art films to come out before the studios took back control, um, making these big budgeted, essentially B movies. Um, and that's not a put down, but it doesn't raise the bar high. A B movie, I've explained before, in the old days when movies came out, there was the A movie and the B movie, and in between there was a cartoon and sometimes a newsreel. This would be in the 40s and 50s and the 60s, and the B movie was always a quickie movie that they made, usually gangster films or film noir. Um, or even a sci-fi movie with a big tarantula attacking the town. They were considered fillers, not to be real taken serious. But over the years, those films took on um, another meaning to a lot of people and became a lot of people's favorite types of films. Shooting a film on a 10-day budget with hardly any money makes a filmmaker creative, and the creativity is shown in the film. Well, after the 1970s faded and the auteur director didn't have the control that they had in the early on in the 70s because of films like Jaws and um Star Wars became bigger than they ever imagined, and Star Wars especially because they became not just films. It's about product. It's about dolls and toys and pajamas and everything else, lunch pails, and that's where they saw a lot of the big money, and studios wanted in on that. And the '80s was primed for the endless sequels. Some decent movies were made in the '70s, like Rocky, and then it became a franchises. Then all of a sudden we had Rocky 1, 2, 3, 4. I think there's 5 or 6 of them now. I think he wants to do another one. He's almost 80, and Stallone wants to do another Rocky. Rocky makes a comeback, and people will watch it. Will line up for it to see how the steroids are working. Anyway, the big films of the '80s were big indeed. Superman with Christopher Reeves. Was kind of like the first cartoon or based on a comic that was starting to become popular in the world. We didn't think anybody could take Superman serious, but they made this movie and it was a large budget movie. And this is before they had CGI, computer generated imagery. This is before the digital world. They had to do the special effects old school. So they flew poor Christopher Reeves around on big wires in a big studio with a backdrop, and then they filled in the backdrop with clouds and skies, like he's flying through buildings and stuff. That was all put in later in editing, but it was old school stunts, and so it has this kind of primitive look to it, and it makes it kind of more interesting and exciting because it kind of looks real, like he's actually possibly flying. Whereas now he's just zipping around like a spaceship, and no, even a Superman like Superman can't even do that. I don't believe. So, and then there was Superman 1, 2, 3, and they made several. Then he had a Christopher Reeves was on a roll. He had a well-respected actor, trained at Yale, I believe. Anyway, then he had a horrible accident on a horse. He used to do the steeplechase jumping. He fell off his horse, broke his neck, and he was paralyzed from the neck down really bad. And he never regained movement. He was actually on a respirator. He could never even breathe again without a respirator breathing for him. And he could only move a wheelchair by blowing into a tube that moved it. It was a really bad life ending break. And yes, he did a couple movies. He even directed a movie in that condition, but he essentially died of those injuries about 5 years after the accident, I believe. Tragedy, tragedy. Um, if anybody's ever ridden horses, and I have, you never know when they're going to throw you off and break your neck. Hopefully, but sometimes it takes you by surprise. Anyway, so then we have these Superman sequels. Um, this is before we did the first Batman, which I think came out in Tim Burton's Batman. I think it was 90 or 89, but we're not there yet. I don't want to talk about Batman yet, which is a decent franchise, was made by a good filmmaker. I'm not saying these films are bad, they're just corporate looking. They're commercial, as big as they can be. And so the special effects are big, the acting's big. You're not to be taken These movies aren't to be taken very seriously, and there's a lot of toy placements and product placements, and hopefully they're making a bunch of money not only on the sequels but on the toys. So that was how filmmaking started to become what it is today in a lot of ways. Other films in that era that were huge mega hits, Tom Cruise, Top Gun would be one of them. They just did a sequel this year, 30 years later, and he's still flying the jets. He's still riding a motorcycle without a shirt on, with no helmet. He's Tom Cruise. He's Superman, except for he's just a very short Hollywood actor who got very powerful because of these sequels. Um, a new breed of actor came out of this. The heroic actor, the anti-hero, was dead. That was in the 60s and 70s when we have movies like Easy Rider, Five Easy Pieces. The anti-hero. They were not heroic. They weren't going to save the culture. They're counterculture. But there's no counterculture in these films. These were straight down the line, and they were made for to be playing in the mass multiple multiplexes, which was starting to spread out throughout the land. These aren't art films playing in college towns. These are playing at the malls near you. Uh, that's where the money was, and that's where Hollywood went to get the money, your money, our money. Uh, and then there would be movies. Steve Spielberg produced movies like I think he produced Goonies, and which was kind of a teenage thing about kids. Um, and he was making his movies like E.T., and they were getting bigger than ever. Uh, um, to me, Spielberg's last good movie was Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I think that came out in '78. Um, there was magic in that film. It wasn't too over the top, although it is over the top. And when I mean that, I mean the story, the pumped up emotions are all really exaggerated. And it's about if you've seen Close Encounters, it's a good movie about alien visitating here. Except for it, what was different about Close Encounters is the aliens weren't trying to destroy the world like all the aliens ever since have been trying to destroy the world. They actually wanted to befriend us. They just had a lot more power than we did because they knew how to get down here, and so we were humbled by their presence. And that's typical Spielberg. He's always humbled by the presence of aliens. Anyway, those movies are popular in the day. For a person who came out of the 60s and 70s that wanted to make important films, art films, It was a bleak time in Hollywood. The independent scene was just starting to make its presence known with filmmakers like John Sayles, David Lynch, Spike Lee, um, Jim Jarmusch. They were leading the way. Still no women, folks. Um, that was not going to happen for another decade. It was still a man's world. Um, there was some female directors from Australia, Jane Campion, but they weren't. And in France, uh, Claire Danes, and there was Lena Miller from Italy, but they were foreign directors, and so their budgets were small, and so they were given. That's okay for a woman to direct those things. They weren't trusted with directing these big franchises. The filmmaker I mentioned in the documentary series, hopefully you guys looked at, uh, Penelope Spears had directed a great punk rock documentary, Decline and Fall of Western Civilization. Then she did also the Decline and Fall, the Metal Years, and then she also did a third one, Skateboard Punks or something in the 90s. But in the meantime, she got some Hollywood assignments to direct films. They were all um, when they weren't be called heavy films. There, well, she did the Little Rascals. If you remember that series from the 30s, they were called Our Gang. Turned into a TV series, and so this is for baby boomers because baby boomers, which I'm a part of, we loved the Little Rascals. We saw them every Saturday on TV. Um, she did a lot of Rascals movies. She got to do Wayne's World, which is a fun movie. Um, the Beverly Hillbillies, they were starting to remake all these old TV shows. For some reason, she got the nod to direct these. Um, I couldn't sit through half of it. It was a little too silly, and I don't care about the Hillbillies. I liked it when I was 10, but as a 35-year-old man, I'm not 35 anymore, but then I was not interested in the Beverly Hillbillies or Little Rascals. Wayne's World, the first one, was fun. Anyway, so she was getting somewhat of a career and cashing a nice paycheck, but they wouldn't be considered serious films, that's for sure. The independent scene wasn't quite happening yet. It's going to happen in the 90s, which I'm going to talk about next week, not this week. Um, but a few filmmakers did sneak in their films because the indie scene was just starting. When I say indie, I'm talking about the finances coming from independent sources, friends, relatives, not through Hollywood studios. That's for sure. They wouldn't have anything to do with these kind of movies. And a filmmaker like John Sayles, who had a very rather successful career as a screenwriter in Hollywood. He had written some. He wrote Piranha, and he wrote a couple other kind of what you would call B movie horror movies, but they paid. They paid off. They gave him street cred, gave him a paycheck, and he just started directing his own movies. And one of his first movies was an independent, low budget movie. I think he made for $70,000, 80,000, called The Return of the Secaucus Seven, about a group of people who went to college together, had a reunion 10 years later, what happened to them, blah, blah, blah. It was a personal film, something he had actually gone through, really well received. And he started to be able to have inroads into a directing career, which probably peaked out in the 80s. I mean, he directed somewhat in the 90s, but you don't see him much anymore because his movies fell out of favor. They were considered personal art films, but he made some. Matt Wan was one I think his best, but he also did some films that never made it a big splash, but did get to play at the local cineplexes. And but his early films were sneaking under the fence into a theater near you, especially if you lived in a college town and played a local college theater. and that was good enough. Another filmmaker who had started in the 70s with Eraserhead. I think I had you guys look at some of that, maybe even wrote your paper on Eraserhead for extra credit. David Lynch was esoteric, really artistic, hard to describe, pinned down filmmaker who directed some Hollywood films like Dune, which was not a success, and um, Elephant Man, which was a successful Broadway play, which was pretty successful. But his films, he got financing and made things like Lost Highway, Blue Velvet, Wild at Heart, a lot of kind of over the top hipster crime movies, and that did very well indeed. And he's established a niche market for his work. His biggest his biggest acclaim came with Twin Peaks, the TV series, that started in about 890. It was only on for 2 years, but it was a huge revolution in new television. I'll talk about that when we get to the 90s. And so David Lynch is still out there. He doesn't have much interest in making movies anymore. He is an artist and has kind of stayed out of the limelight over the years, lost his faith in Hollywood cinema. Um, a new filmmaker started poking out in the 80s, African American, by the name of Spike Lee. And he was a real breath of fresh air. Came out of um, cinema art schools in New York City. He teaches there or has taught there and at Columbia and NYU. Um, and he came out with his film, She's Gotta Have It, which is a low budget kind of sexual coming awakening about some black characters in Brooklyn. Then his big film that put him on the map came out. Uh, he filmed a lot of films in Brooklyn. That's where he was born and raised. And the name of it is escaping me right now. I'll come up with it. I'll show. You'll see the previews. I'll post them. Um, and he started getting commercial money because his films were starting to become successful. Um, he also made most of his money by directing commercials for Nike. He still does, I think, but he directed a lot of the famous Michael Jordan commercials, Nike commercials. He's a basketball freak fan, meaning he's on the court all the time. He's actually got so excited on the court, he's yelled at the players and the managers, and they've had to take him off the court. Anyway, Spike Lee was an original filmmaker that became commercially viable through these endless sequels and these Superman movies and Top Guns movies. Somehow his films resonated with the urban crowd and people who wanted something more like they wanted in the 60s and 70s. And he provided that. That's the 80s, folks. It was kind of the doldrums for inventive art films, but they're still out there. They're still viable. Artists are still trying to make inroads into cinema. It was still an important outlet for expression. In the 90s, everything busted loose with the rise of Sundance Film Festival. Talk about that next time when Story of Film continues. Look for your next essay. It's going to be one of these films. I'll sign it today. It'll be due next week. Good night. See you. It's getting cold. Enjoy your weekend. Good night.